Well, hello, and so thrilled to introduce you to my guest today. I had the privilege of seeing them give a talk at an event here in Dallas where they gave us a primer on what it means to be a transgender youth, something that they have personal experience with identifying as transgender men. They're both LGBTQ plus specialists at the Visions Adolescent Treatment Center in Los Angeles. So I welcome Jordan Held and Beck Gee-Cohen. Thank you so much for being here, guys. Jordan, I want to start with you. You identify as a queer transgender man. So you bring this dual perspective to your work as a mental health provider. You are currently the primary therapist and gender specialist at Visions Adolescent Treatment Center, and you have years of experience as a therapist and intake coordinator at Children's Hospital Los Angeles in the Center for Trans Youth Health and Development, the largest trans youth health clinic in the U.S. So what was it like for you when you went through your gender identity transformation, and where did you go for support?
So thanks for having us on and for talking about this really important topic. I think for me, one of the reasons why I got into this work in the first place was because there aren't a lot of spaces for folks who are starting to navigate their own journey. For me, I didn't start my transition until I was 30. So I was an adult. Navigating a very different space. I didn't have support. I didn't have therapists who understood, from both a personal and professional lens about what it means to be trans. I didn't have kind of the same role models and people in the media and people to look up to. So it was hard. So I leaned on a lot of my, what we like to call chosen family, people that we know who are able to help, guide us in our own path. And I'm still on this journey, right? I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough is about how transition is journey. It's not linear. There are, I'm still going through my gender journey, even to this day. But I think that, really looking for community providers, looking for people who are actually really dedicated to providing affirmative space is what I tried to do and what I'm still doing to this day.
We're going to get into a lot more of that, but thank you for that. Beck, you are the director of LGBTQ plus programming at Visions Adolescent Treatment Center. Same question to you. What was your gender identity transformation experience like, and where did you go for support? And when I say what was it like, there are many layers. There's physical, mental, psychological, emotional, social. There's so many layers. So I'm really asking, that's like a loaded question, but I'm really trying to, I guess the idea is that as Jordan referred to, there might not have been as much support back then for you. So I'm just curious about what you did. Where did you get help?
Yeah. So much like Jordan, I didn't start my transition until later in life. And actually, for me, I was about 5 years sober at the time. And I think without recovery, I probably would not have been able to transition. And however, right, as Jordan referred to the journey, I could remember as far back as 5 years old feeling different, feeling like not part of, feeling like, and it wasn't really until school, I was like 5 or 6 years old, where I was like, standing in the boys' line and getting in trouble, and those very gendered spaces that I was really, I really felt different and other. However, it was these messages that said, well, you can act like a boy at home, but you're a girl. And so I think from a very young age, I learned to mask. I learned to say, okay, well, this is what I have to be. This is how I have to be. This is how I have to live. And there were no models. There was nothing on television. There was no YouTube. There was no, I feel old now. There was no, like, I'm kind of a Gen Xer, so there was not the representation that we see today. And I didn't even meet the first trans guy until I was 21 years old. I knew trans women existed. I actually didn't know that trans men, there was a possibility. And then, it took almost, 8 or 9 years later until I was like, oh, okay, yes. I met him and I said, yes, that's me. And then I was, I shut that down because I was afraid. I was afraid to lose the community that I had built in the LGBT community, identifying as like a lesbian, that I didn't even feel comfortable with that, but that felt most close to who I was. And so for me, it was really when I came out, yes, my chosen family, people that were around me, who supported me, a therapist that was really, vital to my survival, who walked me through what it meant to be trans, because and they were not trans themselves. They just said, we're a great therapist, and said, what do you want? Like, what do you want to do? How do you want this to look? And there's so many different options. There's so many different paths. It's not just one way.
You hit on something there, and I'm sure both of you have heard this because you work with families a lot. And I know that the Visions Center, that's part of their philosophy is involving families. You just hit on something, Beck, when you said, I identified as a lesbian, but I wasn't really comfortable with that even. I'm sure that there are people that say, well, why don't you just be a lesbian? If that's right, can both of you or one of you just talk about that? Why change? Why change your physique? Why change? Become a different gender?
Yeah, and I can start out by talking about that. I think this is a really important kind of first step to understand, is that as a society, we've now gotten accustomed to lumping the LGBTQ, all those letters together. And it's really important to separate the T for transgender as an umbrella term away from the LGB. Your gender identity is different than your sex that you were assigned at birth. And it's different than your, if you're trans, and your sexuality, you can be gay and be trans. You can be straight and be trans. Both those things can be true. And so really important to know that, when you are gender diverse or when you are trans, that there is a marked incongruence between your internal sense of self and your external presentation, right? So different than just who you are attracted to romantically or sexually is really how you feel, right? And how you want people to perceive you. And a lot of times that involves medical intervention to change, your physical sense of self. But a lot of it is mental, right? The reason why so many trans people choose to embark on medical transition is because the hormones in your body, it's incongruent. It doesn't match. It doesn't feel authentic to who you are. And we live in a society where we automatically gender people based on what we see. And this is a really this is an entire talk in and of itself, really just on like how people perceive you and then how they gender you based on what they see. And so, but it becomes really challenging because, as Beck said, there's a fear of and a reality of losing community, right? So as trans men, and I'll speak for myself, but I know Beck shares a similar experience, when we physically transitioned, we lost a big part of our friend groups. We lost a lot of people, a lot of like ability to go into certain spaces. That had saved us in some ways. So, when parents especially talk about, why are you choosing this path? Well, none of this is a choice, right? None of this is a choice. If I felt comfortable being gay or being a lesbian, then I would have stayed with that path. because I already had made a community, but it wasn't about that. That wasn't about my sexual orientation. This is about my gender, who I am, how people read me in the world, and how I feel as a man, knowing that I also now take up, and I have to acknowledge the privilege of taking up the space in the world now as a white man, right? So I went from this place of, being perceived as female, whether or not I felt that way or not, to now taking up space in the world as a white man and holding different privileges. And that's an important lens that is hard as trans men to really grow into, especially when you transition later, because you've experienced misogyny, you've experienced, sexual assaults from, men. You have different, the whole locker room culture and locker room talk is something that we have to kind of like learn and not internalize as something that we needed to do. So Beck, I'll let you speak to that a little bit, because I could go on, I think, about that topic.
I mean, I think you answered it beautifully. I think that, yes, I think that it wouldn't be my choice to, transition to a white man, and take and understanding that space of like, I think there's a lot of speaking to that, a lot of isolating behavior, specifically with trans men and young trans men and who are socialized as female for so long, to like, how do I acknowledge that privilege and not take up space, but then also like lose my voice in a lot of situations. And so, what happens is that we shut down, and it's hard for me, like, I'll just speak for myself, is like, what space do I occupy? I connect more with women in a lot of ways. And I have a lot of female friends, and then when I go into like male spaces or groups, right, how do I navigate those conversations? How do I navigate, this, misogyny that has been like built into our society, and stand up for that, and stand up and say that's not okay, but then also wanting to be accepted at the same time. So it's like, it's a dance that is very, very difficult to navigate. And for young trans men, I think for like the younger, teenagers that we're working with, what happens is that you have this pendulum swing into like a really like I have to be a man, like I have to, and there's this toxic masculinity that's happening. And so what we're really talking about is navigating masculinity and femininity, and what that means for me and for myself, and how is that going to come up against a world that tells me, you need to be this way or that way. And so, as we're creating ourselves and our own personal identity, we're also like up against this world that tells us that we have to be one way or the other. And it's very difficult at times.
And I think that parents really navigate the space of assuming that they're nervous about their young person starting hormones, right? Especially if we're talking about transmasculine people starting testosterone. And they're afraid that is going to impact their emotional regulation. But the reality is it's society that does that. Society is actually dictating how men act in the world, not about a hormone, right? But that is a lack of education, a lack of understanding about like gender roles and gender norms. So when we're talking about being trans or being gender diverse, we're actually just talking about society's perceptions on men and women. Right? We can really break it down more to that.
Wow. There's so much to talk about here. We could go on for days, actually. We work in schools. We teach yoga and mindfulness programs, and we also have professional development that we work with, educators as well. And so, so what would be how would you tell us as teachers working with young people, mostly adolescents like you, and educators who might be watching this? A lot of people who are part of and we work with educators, so That's who, you know, that's who we are attracted to and attracted to us. So how do we navigate? Like, how do we navigate so that we are inclusive, so that there is equity, so we say the right things, so we don't say the wrong things? How do we, because as an educator, we care so deeply. I mean, for the most part, not all, but for the most part, we know that our role is so important, because we could be that one person on that one day that helps that child go from taking a wrong turn to a right turn. And the right turn could be accepting him or herself as accepting their identity. So how do we handle that? I know that there's a lot of ways to look at it, but is there sort of an overarching approach?
Me to start. Okay. So I think that the most important thing that everyone can do is approach with humility. Approach with an understanding that you actually don't need to know everything. As an educator, your job is to show up and be present. And that is, if you align yourself with being present, then young people in particular will gravitate towards you. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know every identity. We do this work every day, and we identify as, you know, part of the community, and young people are teaching Beck and I things every single day. We just listen. We're there to listen. We're there to affirm. We're there to acknowledge that this is hard. We're also there to acknowledge that this can be beautiful. I think one of the things that's getting perpetuated in the media and in a lot of different states because of politics, and we have to really name that, is that being trans is really bad. And you know, being trans can be really beautiful, and it can be really amazing. But it gets shifted when people and parents and educators and therapists pathologize gender. Right. So I think that as educators, you can be present. You can ask questions in a really intentional and meaningful way. If you make a mistake, you can apologize and you can move on. We can learn from our mistakes, and we can withhold our judgments. And it's really important that an educator's values do not need to align with a young person's values. Right? It's not about the fact that, like, I don't believe in this, but it is about the fact that I am not going to verbalize what I am believing and put that on to a young person, right? Because no one can be in their shoes. No one can be in someone else's shoes. So approaching with empathy, and that humility. Yeah.
Yeah, and I began this before I turned on the record button. I did tell you that this interview made me nervous because it was something that I know so little about. And I wanted to make sure that I was going to be, I wanted to make sure I was going to say the right thing and do the right thing. And, you know, but I want to learn so badly. And I think that that's what you're saying, Jordan, is that we don't have to know. We just have to be open and listen and learn and not judge. And, you know, as educators, we're supposed to be that way anyway. I do want to say it's very hard being in Texas, where they've just passed a law and I'm very curious about what you think about this, that they just passed a law that you cannot you have to play the sport of your birth, your gender that you have at birth. And so I would love to know what you both think about that, Beck.
So I think about who this harms, right? And it's a very small percentage of kids, but one kid is enough that it harms. And we're also talking about not being able to participate in play. We're not talking about, I mean, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Olympics or, T-ball, right? we're taking away something that is play, that is fun, that is supposed to be connection, right? And we're forcing a child, to not play. And I wonder, and I think about this, as, growing up and playing sports, and just for me, sports wasn't I'm going to go be an athlete, because I think Jordan can speak to this a little bit more. Sports for me was about connection and play and groups and all of that stuff. And to be told that you can't do that, the psychological harm that and what we're going to see here, and what I think the disconnect is that we're going to see an increase, right, in depression, anxiety, suicidality, and we're going to lose these kids because they're not allowed to just be a kid. And that is the biggest and most problematic thing for me, from my point of view, amongst all the other things, and being kind of a political pawn, right? There's so many other things that we need to be addressing today than to be looking at these young kids and saying well, you can't do that, right? Because I think that is, that is so harmful, psychologically harmful for a young person. And when we think about kids, and Jordan can speak a little bit more of this around hormones and things like that, is kids that are pre puberty are all the same. They're all they have the same body, they're all the same kind of sizes, they're all, they're so similar. And also what about a young person? How are they gonna address that, right? How are they gonna make them pull down their pants to check what, if they're playing the right sport? And again, just the psychological impact of this on young people is so detrimental.
Oh, Phyllis, you're muted.
Yeah, let me just, so we deal with a lot of coaches, PE teachers, because we have our yoga program for athletes and PEs. And so these coaches, I'm a coach. I have I have a girls basketball team, or even, football. Well, let's say girls, because I think so a question might be, I'm competing against somebody who, let's just say this law didn't happen in Texas, and I'm competing against another women's team, girls team, and then there is a male, a transgender woman, girl playing on that team, and they might, someone or a coach might say, hey, that's not fair. They are stronger. They are whatever it is that makes a male different from a female physically, and that it's not fair. What do you say to that argument?
Yeah, and I'll speak to that, and I'll back up a little bit by really saying that this has to do with underlying ability for someone to belong, and we can't not emphasize enough. The reason why 1 out of 2 trans people has 50% has tried to complete suicide is precisely because of this. You're taking away someone's sense of belonging, right? You are taking away their ability, as Beck said, to play, right? To be part of it, or to be competitive, or to be a competitive athlete, or to choose to be an Olympian. You are taking that away. When it comes to that specific argument, I think it's important to understand the baseline understanding of how hormones work. So before, as Beck was saying, as in terms of pre-puberty, all people have estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone in their body, everyone. As no medical interventions for gender are ever taking place before somebody starts puberty, ever. There's nothing to do. And so when we're talking about kids, it's a moot point, right? All kids should be able to play. when it comes to post-puberty, so let's talk about high school, right? Let's name high school. Most people who this is impacting when we're talking about trans youth have started their medical intervention process. And what that means is they've started taking cross-sex hormones. So for somebody who is assigned male at birth, who might identify as a trans female, what that's going to look like is they are on a testosterone blocker and they are adding in an estrogen replacement. So actually, there would be no direct understanding if we were to take blood, if we were to take labs, right? That person, you would not be able to tell the difference between them and somebody who was assigned female at birth and identifies as female. So this is something that when we are purely looking at somebody's physique, we're making all sorts of assumptions about strength, about weakness. And let's go back to this societal understanding that men are stronger and women are inherently weaker, right? So this is where we have to always go back to that framing of what is it that society is assuming? Because I will put my bet any day on most female identified athletes over men, right? But that's a shift over what society believes is strength, and who possesses that. Transgender women are not out there like winning more and taking things away from cisgender women. That is a fallacy. That is something that is not based in fact. And I think that that's a really important thing, because we're making this argument that trans people can't participate in sports under this idea that all of the Hall of Fames are like holding all these trans people. Right? It's like athletes are athletes. Athletes train. Athletes work hard. But this is a very easy, it's an easy catch for people to be transphobic.
Yes. And you have a master's in sports leadership from Northwestern. So it's like, playing sports, Beck, you were saying it is about having fun and being a kid, but it's also playing sports teaches about teamwork. It teaches about competition. When you go out in the world, you're going to be competing for jobs, for, in a job, for whatever. And it's not about becoming a professional athlete. It teaches you so much humility, right?
And I want to add into that, because I think it's really important. In schools, one of the, at least when, and this was a while ago, but even today, the landscape of schools is participation in PE, participation in sports, right? Playing on the playground. There's a reason now where there is a direct correlation to gender diverse youth needing to be homeschooled, needing to be pulled from their school environment because they do not feel safe. Their safety has been taken away in the school. So not only do they not feel safe, they also can't participate in life-saving activities. They're also not getting physical activity. They're also not getting that ability to connect their peers. They're not understanding teamwork, right? It's a ripple effect. It's an absolute domino effect of what's happening to our young people. And so when we're talking about trans youth dying, right, and we can name it, right, trans youth dying, it's because all of these fundamental aspects of childhood are being taken away.
And even we started this whole conversation talking about, hey, you have the visions, and there's, I'm sure, other centers, other facilities, other support that transgender people can have. At the same time, we're still seeing 1 out of 2 are committing suicide or attempting suicide or have suicidal thoughts. So and the fact that they're still unsafe. And so I'd like to ask you if you could name, let's say, the top 3 concerns or 5 concerns that, or issues that transgender youth go through, because that will also enlighten us, people who work with young people, particularly adolescents, it'll enlighten us to know what to look for, like what are the signs, like, you know, so can you name that? Can you name, you talked about safety, and at Fusion, you talked about the bathroom. I mean, something as simple as that. So name it. Name top 3 to 5 challenges that they face, and then and what we can be look for so that we can be supportive.
So we can just kind of run off of each other on this one, Beck. I would say the number one is family support. Family support can mean a lot of different things, but it means that families and parents need to be open to communication. They need to be open to understanding that they might not know everything and that is okay. So I would say family support. I would say school support. That has to do with laws. That has to do, especially if we're talking about public school education, that has to do with state legislature and laws. And then we'll trickle down to medical. There need to be medical resources, support, clinics. What else?
Included in that is mental health support. I would say also, I mean, those would be the top 3, because those are all of these, like, that's the umbrella, right? These umbrella spaces where I think of a young person and the spaces that they navigate, right? School and home, right? And then on top of that, and then the doctors and medical, spaces, right? Like, that's pretty much where kids are. And so what we've seen is, even through COVID or through, it's like they go back to school. Some kids were very stoked to be back at school because that's where where they're supported, right? Where they have school support, but then at home they didn't, or vice versa. They were stoked to be home because they couldn't go to school. So it's like, how do we allow a kid, just to navigate the world and be in the world? And again, we talk a lot about belonging, which is so much more than accepting, right? A sense of belonging is like, I am here and I'm supported. And a lot of the times we put the weight on a kid to find their own support, to, find their own community. And that the problem is that these are vulnerable, individuals who get preyed upon by others. And so, online or even out in the world. And so we need to make sure that they have a place, and that they again, feel the feeling of belonging, being supported is so vital to the survival of these young people.
I'd like you, Jordan, to also talk about the safety, because you had talked about the bathroom issue, something that we take for granted. We have to go to the bathroom, we go to the bathroom in a public place, right? But in a school, that isn't so easy for transgender youth.
Yeah, and it should be easy. I think I want to normalize the fact that it should be easy, right? In the home, we have one bathroom and everybody uses it, and it's never been a problem. And these are usually cisgender heterosexual couples that have no problem sharing bathrooms, right? But all of a sudden we have trans people in the mix, and it's this, once again, I'm going to bring back society. It's an assumption that we know who is trans, that we can pick out a trans person and know that they are different than a cisgender person, right? Everyone has peed next to a trans person in their life. I guarantee it. But not everyone knows that, right? Because we can't tell who's trans and who's not. And so I think that it's so important when it comes to safety. There is a real, especially when people are at the beginning of their transition, it is really scary. I mean, I can name personally, when I first started medically transitioning, there's a very uncomfortable, awkward space, where you don't fit in and you don't know, you're going through all of this noise in your head of, would I rather go into this restroom? Would I rather go into this restroom? And you are spending so much time and energy going through pros and cons of peeing. Like, where do I pee? Like, what is going to be safer? And I remember when I first, my initial kind of thought process was, well, I'm going to keep going into the women's room. Okay. Because at least then I don't have a fear of getting physically injured or attacked. But then what happened is people would say like, oh, you're in the wrong restroom, or why are you not in the men's room? Therefore, I'm a predator. Right. So it's this aspect of like, I'm either a predator or I have fear of getting beaten up. Therefore, what happens is that I don't use the restroom. And now what happens for youth, particularly at schools, when I do intake assessments, one of the questions that I always ask is, how often do you use the restroom? Kids will say, I don't. Now, what does that mean? That's a health risk, right? So they leave home in the morning at 7 a.m. They get home at 4 p.m. They don't have any liquids, so they're completely dehydrated. And they don't pee. So they have increased risk of UTI and other health problems. Now that is real. That comes from a place of that fear and that lack of safety. And we've made it about a bathroom, right? When it's not that. It's about people's discomfort and about people's, once again, transphobia. But this is a real thing for trans people. I mean, bathrooms, locker rooms. So the importance of making sure that we have access to gender neutral facilities, not at the other side of campus. What I often hear, I spend a lot of time on the phone with like administrators of schools, and it's like, but we have a gender neutral bathroom. And I'm like, where is it? And they're like, well, it's a 10-minute walk. Okay, so you're othering that kid, right? You're already putting them on an unequal playing field. How does that make you feel? That's isolating. And so these are some of the things that schools need to keep in mind, or where are your gender neutral facilities where young people can feel like they can go and feel safe and also not feel like they're different than their peers, because they already feel different.
Yeah, and even being an adolescent, whether even not being trans youth, is like, it's really rough. It's just being a teenager could really suck big time, right? Because we don't know. There's just so much, there's such a change just in general. And then adding this to that, when you talk about that sense of belonging, it just breaks my heart. But that sense of belonging is so important. But even with the transgender bathroom, even if it's smack in the middle of the school, that still to me is separating. It's not accepting that youth's identity, that they have their chosen identity. It's saying, well, you can't use the boys' room or the girls' room. You have to go here because you're different. So even at that, it's just, but then as an administrator in a school, it's like, you don't want all the boys using the girls' restroom, it's like, so, it's difficult. And I mean, that's all there is to say. It's like, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Right?
And a couple of things. I want to make a language shift. Because I think it's important, because we started off this talk with how it's okay that we don't know everything as long as we're willing to learn. I want to get rid of this word choice. The word chosen identity makes it seem like this was a choice. If you asked any trans person, would they choose to be trans? They would all say no. Though it can be a fine life, right? It's not something that anyone chooses to go through, right? So, same thing when we're talking about pronouns and name, to not use the word preferred. We just say like, what is your name? What are your pronouns? And we do that for everyone, just like we would say to cisgender person, like, how would you describe your identity? Right? So we're normalizing this conversation for everyone around us, without the idea of a choice or a preference. Because I think that we need to get away from because parents hold on to that language. Well, you're choosing this. you're choosing this. Why are you choosing this? And it's like, well, it's not a choice, right? Why would I choose this life? Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of name that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I have one more question. So we're starting to see, so much, and you were talking about when you were younger, when you were, there was no YouTube well, now we're actually seeing shows like Pose, and sex education, and we're starting to see even on a whole other experience, even about interracial relationships, and like it's beginning to happen where we're trying to normalize it. How important do you think media, entertainment is to helping to normalize and helping people understand and see and accept transgender people?
Yeah, I'll jump in here because I love media. I think media really leads the way. Media helps to normalize, not only normalize, but also bring trans identities into the living room of especially rural communities, places that not everyone can be reached, right? And so, 10 years ago, trans women of color, the only representation you saw on television was, on like SVU shows, and they were sex workers and they were murdered and they were, that's the representation that was there, right? So today, like you said, we have shows like Pose, we have shows, like sex education that show like how, how we can just be, right? Again, going back to belonging, that we're just like we are part of this community. We've been part of, trans people have been part of the world forever, right? And so when we start to see, not just, and yes, obviously as being a trans person and seeing another, a trans identity and identities in these like positive lights, in these like powerful spaces, in these, and I see me, I feel connected, right? And I mean, but I just, the power of having a trans person being put into, and it's not stories, we usually also only see stories of tragedy around trans people. And we only, like, I go to so many talks around trans identity and it's always this like, just this like heavy, we've talked about a lot of heavy things and it's necessary, right? But we never really talk about the celebration and the joy of being trans and being, in this world. And I think that like people that are not trans, families, parents, need to see that we can be, we can live full, happy, joyful lives, right? I mean, and so when we have representation like that in the living rooms, and I can tell a parent, hey, go watch this show, like, go see how that, and it can almost detach themselves a little bit from like their reality, and they can kind of jump into this kind of alternate universe, but it can parallel a lot of times, and they can see like, oh wow, like that's a possibility. They call them possibility models, right? And I think that's just so important, right? We we run support groups for trans kids and stuff, and LGBT kids and families. And a lot of times they're talking about heavy things, but what's really important is to bring, trans people, trans adults in, and even younger trans people, like in their early adulthood, and saying like, I'm living my life. I'm going to college. I have a full scholarship to Harvard. Like I have these things, like I live this life, and that's such a great opportunity to see that this is possible, that I can live and be happy, And
I have to say that what Pose is really about is family. Mm-hmm. They choose a different family because their families, disown them, but it's finding a new family, and two things, Jordan, if you can speak to that, the family, or actually Beck, speak to that aspect of choosing a new family. You both made reference. And then I want to end this conversation with each of you use the word, it could be really beautiful thing to be a transgender person. And I'd love to know how you would describe that beauty. So before I go to there, I do want to ask you about family, because somebody watching, might not have been disowned by their family, and how important family, I put that in quotes, is.
Yeah. And I think chosen family, we talk about it a lot. Well, you can have a chosen family, and that's really important. And I also want to normalize the grief around losing your family, right? The people that, were supposed to love you, they were supposed to, and many people, not just trans people, go through this, right? Loss of family and find chosen family. And it's not like it just happens, right? It's not like, creating these relationships is difficult, and long, right? Creating relationships of family and navigating that. And and it's possible. And I think that, as I've had my chosen family in so many different parts of my life, right? As throughout the coming out process, that my biological family, it took a while for them to catch up. And I feel blessed and grateful to have both of those. I have, I still have family members that don't talk to me, right? And that we don't speak. However, I have a mom that came around. I have, a sister that came around, I have those people. But, I want to say that for me, my chosen family is most important in my life, my friends, the people in my community. And when I also say chosen family, it is if a trans person were to call me today and I did not know them from any space, they got my number, which happens quite a bit. And I know this happens for Jordan a lot too, that they are automatically part of this chosen family. I will do whatever I can to help them, and, help them have a sense of belonging, because we're such a small community, because we see what happens when people don't reach out their hands and help. That is really important for me. So chosen family can look like one phone call one day, or it can look like friendships that have lasted years and years. So it's so vital to the survival of me personally.
Yeah. And as a mental health provider, I also want to say, I always approach a family with the assumption and idea that they can shift and they can change. I never put even the most, a family that presents as the most unaccepting family, I never put it off the table that they love their child, right? And I think that as educators and mental health providers and health workers, whoever we are, we can all approach people with this idea of okay, you're not there yet, but let's get there. And it might take a long time, and that's okay. Be patient with the process. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about sports. I want every kid and every high schooler to be able to play sports, or to be able to play the role that they want in their high school musical. It's not about that. It's about people having, part of ending this is about going back to a theme that we've talked about during this whole hour, which is about control, right? And society. Right. This is about the society's desire to have control over people's bodies, right? And over people's ability to feel safety and feel belonging in a world that, as you said, Phyllis, most young people, it's hard enough to navigate adolescence, let alone having to navigate adolescence without the choice, but also knowing that you do not feel, comfortable and like yourself in your own body. And so I think, family comes in all different shapes and sizes. And educators are a big part of that family. I recently, a couple of weeks ago, spoke to my high school, and I went to an all-girls school back in Boston, and my old advisor and coach from 7th grade, so we're talking about going back a couple of decades, was there. And I was like, talking about how much that person impacted me because they were out as gay at the time. And I was not even out as gay, but I saw it, right? As a kid, I saw it. I wasn't comfortable with myself, but having people around you that are out can create that safety, even if it's not verbalized.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll see more and more of that. So both of you, very quickly, we've reached an hour. We can talk another hour. I know, but we all have things to do and places to be, and people to help. So if you could just button this up with, what is Beck, what is beautiful about being a transgender man? Or the transgender,
there's so much, right? There's so much beauty in just being able to be me, like authentic and true. I still struggle with humanity, right? Being a human. And it's so much easier today being a human in my own body and in my own truth. I don't have to battle that anymore, which I'm very grateful for. And I have the coolest friends and people in my life, the most creative, empathetic, wonderful people who are doing the same work, who are doing the same, living the same life. And they come from all different walks of life. And I just and I'm just so grateful that I got a chance to survive and see that and be part of this.
Jordan.
Yeah, I think for me, it's knowing that and I often say to a lot of young people, reframe this as you have a superpower, right? You have the knowledge of certain things that a lot of people have never known, right? You've lived in different, aspects of society. And that while that can be scary, that can also be really beautiful. And, for me, it's knowing that I can be loved, knowing that, you can be loved for who you are. You can have, an amazing partner. You can have an amazing life. You can have a successful career. You can provide. You're a person, right? I think that when when society can get out of, the collective lens of that diversity is inherently a negative thing, we're all going to be in a better space. But I do think that transness is beautiful if given support. And if given the platform, people can learn. Not everyone needs to understand, but really coming to the table with curiosity is okay. Because we don't expect everyone to understand what we have gone through, because everyone goes through different parts of their journey and is still doing so. But being at least open to understanding differences is really vital to this.
Thank you both so much. One of these days I'm going to come out there to LA, and we're going to go and have major coffee or dinner or lunch, and we're just going to talk forever. You have enlightened me. First time I met you today, and I hope others will be enlightened as well. And thank you both for all the work that you do.
Awesome. Thank you, Phyllis. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Phyllis.